And thanks to all of you for coming out this evening to hear about Venezuela. In a way, I'm happy about that people are interested in Venezuela, because for many years, I've been going to Venezuela since 1975. It's been a long time. And for a lot of that time, nobody was interested in Venezuela. But the sad thing is that it's now all too interesting for very depressing reasons, and I think that's why a lot of you are here. So I'm going to talk about this. Here's an overview. I'm going to kind of compare how Venezuela used to be politically and economically with how Venezuela is now politically and economically, and you'll see that there's an amazing contrast, a terrible contrast. And then I'll do some analysis to try to explain why this happened and how it happened, and then spend a little time at the end speculating about scenarios for the future. Of course, no one has a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can at least speculate about some possibilities and weigh the pros and cons of those. So this is an index of electoral democracy. This comes from one of the main projects I'm working on these days with colleagues all over the world to produce measures of democracy. So since I happen to have them handy, they work their way into my slides. Measures of democracy and corruption and some other things. But this just gives you an idea of Venezuela's history of democracy. So in these charts, the lower down, the more toward the bottom you are on the chart, the less democratic the situation is, and the higher up you are, the more democratic it is. And this is a measure of electoral democracy, which is kind of a low basic standard for democracy. And this chart goes from 1900 to 2016. This one ends in 1998 because I cut it off. Because I just wanted to make the point that for a long time in the 20th century, Venezuela was considered a country that had no chance to be democratic or stable. It was a country that, since it gained independence around 1811, had just a history of dictatorships and civil war over and over again for a long time. And it finally became kind of a stable dictatorship around 1901, or no, I'd say 1899. And then liberalized a little bit in the 1930s, you see there. And then it had a really brief experiment with trying to be democratic in the 1940s. There was a period from 1945 to 48 called the trienio, which just means 3-year period. And they finally had their first full suffrage presidential election in 1948, and then 8 months later, that president was overthrown in a military coup. So that experiment didn't last too long. Then there was another dictatorship. And then, kind of miraculously, in 1958, 59, there was a transition to democracy. And suddenly, Venezuela became a fairly democratic country. And it became almost boringly stable and democratic for the next 40 years after that point. So that was the impression that a lot of people had about Venezuela for a long time. It's one of the most democratic countries. As Adriana said, it survived the Cold War period. A lot of other South American countries underwent military dictatorships in the 1960s until the late 1980s or even 1990, as we'll see. So I'll just compare it to a few other cases according to the same measure. So that's the same index for Venezuela, but starting in 1946. So you compare it to Chile, which is the lighter blue line. Chile was becoming more and more democratic, especially as suffrage extended, but the decline there was with the coup against Salvador Allende and the Pinochet government, and it remained a dictatorship until about 1990. Brazil was never as democratic as Venezuela was, really, and then it also had a military dictatorship in 1964, and then more slowly democratized in the 1980s. Mexico had a single party system, dominant party system, ever since the revolution, and just very slowly became a little bit more democratic over this period, and finally it was considered democratic by the year 2000. And Cuba, of course, was one of the least democratic countries in the hemisphere with the revolution in 1959, and has kind of stayed near the bottom there. So compared to a lot of prominent neighbors, Venezuela was a relatively democratic country and a very stable country. So this is the situation we were looking at, but now looking at today, these are the years since 1998. And you can see this trend has gone, it's like Venezuela fell off a cliff. And the quality of the electoral democratic regime has really, really deteriorated to the point where almost nobody would call it a democracy today. I think it's pretty frankly some kind of dictatorship. So politically, there's something that needs to be explained here. How did one of the most stable and most democratic countries in Latin America suddenly become a dictatorship? Economically, this is a line tracing per capita GDP for Venezuela from 1946 to 2017. And you can see that during the last dictatorship before this, the Pérez Jiménez dictatorship, and during the first 20 years of the democratic regime in Venezuela, the economy grew really fast. So in this period, the per capita GDP increased by 89%, which is just a fantastic performance record for that period of time. Then in the next period, from 1977 to 2017, the next 40 years, the economy declined by 41%. You hardly ever see a country's economy deteriorate that much over such a long period of time. This is just a catastrophic decline in the standard of living for Venezuela, with some ups and downs, of course, and we'll be talking about those. But what this means net is that over 70 years, Venezuela lost all of the progress that it made. So from 1946 to 2017, basically per capita GDP now is where it was in 1946. And just imagine if our GDP, per capita GDP, were what it was in 1946. It's just a terrible human tragedy what has happened in Venezuela. So we're going to talk about what's going on there. There also has always been a problem of inequality in Venezuela. It's a country that has had extremes of wealth and poverty. So here's a photo of the Los Palos Grandes neighborhood of Caracas, which has, first world buildings and great landscaping and things like that. And I think it still looks pretty much like that superficially. But along with it, ever since the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, you have these big zones that are called ranchos. In Brazil, they would be called favelas, or just shanty towns is, I guess, the best English word, in which mostly squatters invade land that they do not own and start building houses. And they're built, not up to code. Sometimes they get washed away if there's a mudslide. And so they're living in very precarious situations. So inequality has been a problem as well. Poverty has always been something of a problem in Venezuela, but it has gotten much, much worse in the last few years. So here are rates of poverty, like percentage of the population that lives on, I believe the standard for this index is something like $5.50 a day, kind of a higher standard of poverty than the UN usually uses. But so we're going from like 25% of the population living at that standard of poverty up to, in 2017, 87% of the population now is living in this really low poverty rate. It's just, the economy has been collapsing. People are really struggling. As a result of that, not surprisingly, so this starts in 2000 and goes to only to 2015, rates of malnourishment or undernourishment, people who do not get enough nutrition in a typical day to meet their energy needs. And during the Chavez government that we'll be talking about, rates of undernourishment declined pretty well from about 2001 until 2009 or 10. There was some progress there, but it didn't last. When the economy began collapsing, incomes fell, and there were other problems that we'll talk about. There was a problem of hunger. And there have been some just bone-chilling statistics about how much weight the average Venezuelan has lost in the last 2 years. People are really not getting enough food to eat. And this ends in 2015. If we continue this to 2017 or 2018, I assure you that line would continue going up. There are also other problems: crime and violence. These are statistics on number of murders per 100,000 people. This is, most of the countries in the world are included in this for around 2015. This is a histogram, so it's showing how many countries are at each. So these are different levels of murder: more murder, less murder, and the height of the bar reflects the number of countries that are in those categories. And most countries have really, really low murder rates. But the top 3 countries for murder rates in the world right now are El Salvador, which is really extreme, and then Honduras, and then Venezuela is number 3. So that's been a problem too. So Venezuela has gone from being one of the better places to live in Latin America to being a place that a lot of people would like to leave. And so migration has become an issue as well. 3 million people, 10% of Venezuela's population, have left the country in the last 20 years. And 1.2 million of those people left in just the last 2 years. There's just a massive wave of emigration from Venezuela. In public opinion surveys, 40% of the population say that they would like to leave the country. They would like to just pick up and move. Could you imagine 40% of Americans saying they would like to live in a different country? A lot of them, the largest chunk of them, over 500,000 Venezuelans, have moved to Colombia, which is the easiest country to get to from Venezuela. And they now constitute over 1% of Colombia's population. And this compares with some cases that have gotten a lot more attention, like the 600,000 Syrians who are now in Germany. That's less than 1% of Germany's population. And the 700,000 Rohingya that have been forced to go to Bangladesh, that's less than 0.5 percentage point of Bangladesh's population. So this is migration of Venezuelans to Colombia has put a big strain on Colombia. We could go on. Malaria has returned. This has been a big problem, big public health problem as well. Venezuela was the first country in the world to wipe out malaria, and now it's one of the first countries to re-experience malaria returning to its society, and it's just unable to combat it. So there's a lot to explain here. How on earth did this happen? I'm gonna put up a kind of a complex path diagram here, but I'm gonna put it up in pieces so I can explain it bit by bit. So one is, it's an important fact that Venezuela is an oil exporting country. It has the largest oil reserves in the world, if you count some low-grade sulfur-infused petroleum that's in the ground. And oil has shaped the Venezuelan economy since 1917. Two of the consequences of the oil economy are that so much revenue flows into the government from exporting oil that it basically doesn't have to tax its own citizens very much to pay for government operations. And so taxes have always been really, really low for individuals and even for corporations in Venezuela. But at the same time, the government has, in spite of low taxes, has been able to have a lot of resources to spend during a lot of its history, especially when oil prices go up. Venezuela enjoys these tremendous windfalls of revenue, and so they have just spent a lot of money during those times. Another issue is that it has kind of a weak state. It's not the most efficient bureaucracy in the world, and that makes it difficult to enforce the rule of law. And so there are a lot of people who do things kind of on around the margins. Another problem that goes along with this is what some Venezuelans used to call partidocracia, which means partyocracy or partyarchy, which means that where Lincoln practiced law, if he said it's the government of the people, by the people, for the people, we could call partidocracia government of the people, by the parties, for the parties. As there were two very strong political parties in Venezuela for a long time, AD and COPE. I won't say too much about them. but they kind of alternated in power during the democratic regime, and they were ideologically fairly close to each other, kind of Tweedledee and Tweedledum for a lot of years. And they kind of colluded to not prosecute each other for corruption, and so corruption grew during this period. The downside of the oil boom is that sometimes it's followed by oil busts. That is, the price of oil goes way down and suddenly the government is caught short. It's not getting the revenues that it was counting on, and so other things happen. There's an economic recession, unemployment rate goes up, they have to cut spending on various things, or instead of cutting spending, sometimes they just borrow money. They just say, hey, we're good for it. We have the largest oil reserves in the world. You can lend to us, don't worry, we can repay it. We're very credit worthy. And so Venezuela often did this. During boom times, it would spend a lot of money and even go deeply into debt, thinking that it was going to continue having oil revenues for a long time. And then when the oil bust came, they suddenly had this big debt that they couldn't pay. And this has happened several times in Venezuela's history. So I talked about corruption a little bit. So when a recession happens and they've borrowed a lot of money, they have this big debt burden, and that forces them to make some choices about, for example, cutting subsidies. Venezuela used to subsidize a lot of things. In fact, still does subsidize a lot of things like public transportation, especially gasoline. Gasoline is cheaper than water, I think, in Venezuela these days. It's just like less than 10 cents a gallon to buy gasoline. They're basically losing money on every tank of gas that they sell to Venezuelans. They're selling it below cost. And also to cover shortfalls in the budget during a recession, the government has developed the habit of just printing more money. And this is the exact same strategy that got Weimar Germany into trouble when they were just printing more and more money. And so if you have more and more bits of currency chasing the same supply of goods and services, prices go up. And so that leads to terrible inflation and requiring the country to devalue the currency. But when you do these things, it has made Venezuelans very angry because Venezuelans kind of came to expect that the government would be providing them a lot of benefits. They all have this impression, we live in a rich country. We have the largest oil reserves in the world. We're entitled for the government to pay for a lot of things in our life. We shouldn't have to pay taxes. The government can pay for everything out of oil revenues. And so when subsidies that the government used to pay are cut back, people feel like an entitlement has been removed from them. And what's worse, if they feel like the government is cutting back on the budget in order to pay for corruption that is still going on, they really feel angry about that. I kind of liken it to a telenovela. If the Venezuelan people are a wife and the Venezuelan government is the husband, and the wife notices that their standard of living has been dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping, and then she finds out that it's dropping not because they're really poor, but because her husband has been buying a nice apartment for his mistress, then you can imagine how angry people feel about this kind of situation. And that kind of cynicism and anger at first led Venezuelans to stop participating in elections at the same high rates they used to. They used to have turnout of over 90%, which would be nice if we had that. But it started dropping to 60, 55%, to those levels. And then when things really got out of hand, then there started to be food riots and other kinds of riots, just looting and rebellion from time to time. So illustrating boom and bust cycles, here's a graph of world oil prices. This goes from 1946 to 1998. And so many of you who are my age or older will remember the first OPEC oil shock in 1973, 74. So this was actually this little spike here. And then there was a second spike, the second OPEC oil shock, where prices jacked up even more than that. And Venezuela profited from that mightily. During the first oil shock, Terry Carl calculated that The government that was lucky enough to be in power at that time in Venezuela from 1974 to 79, it received 52% more revenue from oil in that 5-year period than all previous Venezuelan governments since 1917 combined. Can you imagine what a huge windfall that was for them? And so, you know, they just started spending money on anything, you know, and giving huge grants and raising salaries and paying bribes and everything. So corruption surged during that period, and things got even worse during the next government under Luis Herrera Campins. And then the bottom fell out of it. Oil prices tanked. They had run up a huge debt, and they couldn't pay it, and they were in terrible trouble. Here's another way of looking at this. So it's not just the price of oil, it's also how much oil Venezuela is producing, and that changes. And it's also per capita, like the population is growing at the same time. So if you combine those things, you get a more realistic estimate of the impact it has on the economy. So this is the value of oil production per capita in Venezuela. And in this same, well, up to 2006. I don't have data after that. But you can see there was a huge couple of spikes in the mid-1970s and the early 1980s, and then things really got bad. Things started to go up a little bit under Chavez, but then they went down again. And corruption increased. You would expect under democracy corruption would get better because politicians should be accountable to the voters. This was the long period of dictatorship. This was the brief experiment. This is the last dictator. And then here's a democratic period. And you notice that the measure of corruption, so the higher up, the more corrupt on this graph. So the level of corruption increased a little bit, not tremendously, but some, even though it was a period of democracy. So here's one of the reactions to this. There were 3 days of rioting in February, March of 1989 called the Caracazo, which means kind of the blow to Caracas, in which people got angry because, well, the primary precipitant was that the subsidy for bus fares was withdrawn. And so suddenly people had to pay 2 or 3 times as much to ride the bus. And they had trouble getting to their jobs because of that, because they couldn't afford it. And so people just took to the streets and started rioting and demonstrating, breaking windows, running in, stealing food, stealing TV sets, stealing refrigerators, doing all kinds of stuff. And the government of the day decided to send in the National Guard, which was not trained in crowd control, and just started shooting into crowds in the street, killing several hundred people. So this was a terrible disaster. And one of the people in the military who felt awful about this was Hugo Chavez Frias, who was a paratrooper, a lieutenant colonel, and he felt like the Venezuelan government should never fire on its own people, and he was determined to stop that. And he eventually became president of Venezuela. But 3 years after this Caracazo, Chavez had organized a coup coalition, a group of people to lead a coup to try to overthrow the president of Venezuela, Carlos Andrés Pérez, because of his economic policies. Pérez came into office leading people to believe that he was going to return Venezuela to its glory days of economic growth, but instead he adopted an economic shock program that did precisely the reverse of what people thought he was going to do. And so there was a lot of anger about that, and Chavez led this attempt to overthrow the government. And mysteriously, 6 years later, Venezuelans elected him president after leading a failed coup attempt. Now, I think that requires an explanation. So I'm going to offer you a bunch of reasons why Chavez became a popular political figure after leading a failed coup attempt. One is, of course, as I've explained, that Venezuela had gone through this long period, 20 years, of economic stagnation and decline, an experience that most countries never have. And secondly, it was like there was a lot of corruption that was going along with this. And so, you know, my theory is that often people can tolerate the government asking them to tighten their belts, but if they're asking people to tighten their belts while the politicians are loosening their own belts, then that becomes intolerable. And so he was he was speaking to that anger. So, in this slide, you see he's speaking to the press in the aftermath of the coup attempt. He got a platform, a media platform, as a result of leading this effort. And he basically told Venezuelans exactly what they wanted to hear, which is that this is a rich country, you deserve your share of our national patrimony, but you're not getting it because these darn politicians are so corrupt. And I want to throw them out and clean house and restore to you what is yours. And that's a message that sat very well with a lot of Venezuelans. Going along with this, the two traditional parties, AD and COPE, were losing more and more support because they had alternated in power and neither one had really been able to reverse the economic decline or fight the corruption. And so they lost a lot of legitimacy, creating a political vacuum, and Chavez stepped in to fill it. And by leading a coup attempt, he showed himself to be a decisive man of action, like, oh, finally, here's somebody who's really going to do something. He also kind of had a popular touch, like his way of speaking. He had kind of a crude way of speaking and a kind of an uncultured, uneducated way. I don't know. He was a smart person, but he spoke in a way that appealed to the everyday common Venezuelan. Juan Bimba is their name for the common Venezuelan. Also, he was a military man, and of all the institutions in Venezuela, according to surveys, the military had the highest amount of respect from Venezuelans. So that was an image in his favor. And also, he used a lot of nationalistic rhetoric. He idolized Simón Bolívar, the great liberator of South America during the Wars of Independence, and tried to emulate him. And that made a lot of Venezuelans feel proud about that. And then there's a lot of speculation about, whether he got support because he was on the left, his left wing, and eventually declared himself to be building socialism for the 21st century. But I want to say in the beginning of his political career, that's not what he was really emphasizing. It came out later, after he had consolidated his control of the political system. And I think he really did have it before because he had been plotting with former guerrillas even in the early 1980s. So I think he really was on the left, but he kind of sublimated that for a while until he got into a position where he could really do something. So anyway, but that wasn't really much of the basis of support. In fact, the poorest Venezuelans were less likely to vote for Chavez in the 1998 election than middle-class Venezuelans were. And in fact, there were some business leaders and big conglomerates who contributed heavily to his campaign. So his image in the beginning wasn't what it later became. So another phase of this was consolidation of his regime, the Chavista regime. So he was elected president in 1998, took office in 1999, and proceeded to do a bunch of things that made him, in essence, an elected dictator of Venezuela. First thing he did was summon a constituent assembly. There was really no provision in the Constitution for doing that, but the Supreme Court went along with it and said, okay, if that's what the people want, we'll let that happen. And he kept harping against the 1961 Constitution. In my opinion, there was really nothing wrong with the 1961 Constitution. And the real reason he wanted to do this was so that he could get a constituent assembly elected, and the constituent assembly could say, we're the legislature of Venezuela, we don't need the other one. And so it could disband the existing Congress, disband the Supreme Court, reappoint the Attorney General, appoint all the electoral authorities, and that's exactly what happened. So they did rewrite the Constitution, but they also eliminated all the other centers of power that could have been acted as checks and balances on President Chavez. Mega elections were held in 2000, like all the offices that could be elected were elected in 2000, so that led to renewal, replacement of all the old political leaders that were there. The new the Constituent Assembly and then the National Assembly granted Chavez decree powers for a year and a half, in which he could issue decrees on some major fundamental pieces of legislation. And he ended up not doing anything with those decree powers until like the last couple of weeks when he had them, and when he issued a lot of sweeping decrees that gave him the power to seize control over different parts of the economy. In reaction to that, a lot of people in the opposition rose up and took to the streets and had these massive demonstrations and ended up kind of marching on the presidential palace, and it was starting to look like a coup attempt. And then an actual coup attempt happened, in which some members of the armed forces collaborated with a business leader and deposed Chavez for about 2 days, and said that the Congress was dissolved, and they said, we're the new power here. But then there were more demonstrations in the street, and Chavez was restored to power. And so that was another failed coup attempt. And the opposition leaders were completely discredited to the extent that they offered support for this coup attempt, because this was a break with the Constitution. In reaction to this gave Chavez the legitimacy that he needed to purge the courts and to continue purging the military to make sure that anyone who was opposed to him was out of any position of power. In reaction to that, because part of the power that was controlled was the Electoral authority, the opposition decided to boycott the 2005 parliamentary elections. Sorry. Okay. They boycotted that, and so for 5 years, 2005 to 2010, there was no opposition in the national parliament. And that also gave Chavez free rein to do basically what he wanted to do, because the Legislative Assembly would rubber stamp whatever he wanted to do. He also used his powers to intimidate the media, to shut down a major TV station, and intimidate and silence or cause self-censorship from major newspapers, et cetera. But he was also really lucky with the economy, because you saw these oil prices here up to 1998. Look what happened after Chavez came into power. Price of oil suddenly went up. Chavez deserves no credit for that. No one country in the world has control over the price of oil in world markets. It's not up to, Saudi Arabia has some influence to the extent that it can organize other members of OPEC to cut back on production. But Chavez had no control over that. He just was very lucky that the price of oil precipitously went up as soon as he became president and stayed there the whole time. And look at his unfortunate successor, Nicolas Maduro. The price of oil plummeted as soon as Chavez died and Maduro came into office. I would have to say that Chavez was very lucky that the price of oil cooperated with what he wanted to do. And because of that, this paid for a lot of his programs. He had really rapid economic growth in some years, including this almost unprecedented statistic of 16.6% growth in 2004. We're straining to maintain 3% in the US. He set up a bunch of kind of clientelistic programs called misiones, or missions, to provide housing and education and medical care targeted for poor people in exchange for political support. And he's granted subsidized oil to Cuba and a bunch of other countries in the Caribbean basin. And Cuba supplied doctors to help staff health clinics in Venezuela in exchange for that. And for several years, they had some success at reducing the rate of poverty and expanding education and lowering infant mortality. And some people said, oh, well, Chavez was really great at doing that. But if you really look at the performance record, a lot of other Latin American countries were also reducing poverty and expanding education and lowering infant mortality at the same time, without having all these oil windfalls that Venezuela was having. In fact, I would think that Venezuela should have been able to do more with those resources than it actually did. However, what they were doing was not a sustainable model for development. It really increased Venezuela's dependence on oil. There used to be a manufacturing sector. There used to be other kinds of mining. There used to be some agriculture in Venezuela. But all those things were de-emphasized in order to emphasize extracting resources from PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, in order to pay for these social programs. And there were market distortions like price controls and exchange controls that created disincentives for people to invest in agriculture and manufacturing. So those sectors of the economy declined. It was difficult to make a profit in those sectors. For example, there were farmers who were producing things, but there were price controls that were so low that they could not make a profit selling their agricultural goods on the market. So they would put them in a warehouse and hope that the price would go up. then they would be accused of hoarding, and and manufacturers would do this too. And the government would say, well, we have these disloyal, unpatriotic hoarders who are preventing goods from getting to the Venezuelan people. So we're not going to let this stand. We're going to confiscate those assets and shunt them into the state-owned store system so that we can make sure they get distributed at rates that everybody can afford. And so they did this progressively time and time again. And obviously, people in the private sector didn't want to put up with this, so they kept, just abandoning Venezuela and saying, we can't do business here anymore. And the state sector grew, and the private sector declined. So there was capital flight. Nobody wanted to invest much in the Venezuelan economy except in the oil sector. That continued, even from U.S. companies. But the oil company PDVSA declined because the way it was being used, they were extracting as much of the resources as they could to pay for other things and not investing sufficiently in maintaining the plant and equipment. And so the physical facilities that PDVSA had began to decline, and especially declined during a general strike in 2002, 2003, when kind of in reaction to PDVSA shutting down to try to remove Chavez, Chavez fired thousands of workers in the oil company, including top-level managers. And so there was a lack of trained personnel to manage the oil company after that point. And so that helped it decline as well. And corruption actually increased, as you can see here. So this little bump is during the Chavez government. And here you can see the deterioration of oil production after this point, and this has really accelerated in the last year. Oil production is now about half what it was in the mid-1990s, just because they can't produce that much. Things keep breaking down. And corruption increased. Okay, so in 2013, things changed a little bit because Chavez died. He had cancer. He'd been fighting cancer for quite some time, and in March of 2013, he died. Before that, he had handpicked a successor, Nicolás Maduro, who was chosen because he was utterly loyal to Chavez as a person. People say he's not the brightest person. People thought he was kind of a joke and kind of made fun of him in the first year of his presidency, but after that he turned out to be a pretty savvy operator in maintaining loyalty and making deals with the military to stay in power. And unfortunately for him, oil prices fell dramatically because there had been too much production of oil around the world. There was a glut, an oversupply of oil, and particularly the shale gas fracking was growing in the United States, and that was a replacement for petroleum. And so that reduced U.S.'s demand for foreign oil. And so demand declined, prices fell. They continued printing money, and that accelerated inflation. And they also neglected to address a growing public safety problem. You already saw the statistics about political murders. And in fact, some of this is not only ignored, it's tacitly encouraged. Because there are groups of I would say, armed thugs who were affiliated with the Chavistas, who are now called colectivos, who basically used to be just political supporters who would intimidate opposition in political rallies and things, but when the economy really declined, they became very dependent on payments they were getting from the government to survive. And when those payments declined, they became self-supporting by kidnapping people and extorting money and robbing things, and the government just turns a blind eye to that. They rarely get caught or punished for those actions because they're supporters of the government. This is one of the most striking graphs I managed to produce. This just shows how many bolívares, local currency, it takes to buy $1. So this is a reflection of the exchange rate. And you can see, hey, it's going up. So obviously there's a lot of inflation. The exchange rate is getting worse and worse for Venezuela. But the really striking thing about it is that this vertical axis is a logarithmic scale. So the scale doesn't go from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50. It goes from 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 to 1,000,000. So it's just, if I didn't put it on a log scale, it would look like a flat line that suddenly goes up like that. It would be a hockey stick. And so it's just like the Venezuelan currency has become practically worthless. I hear stories about Venezuelans going across. I mean, this is a fact. Some Venezuelans carry the currency across the border into Colombia, and then because the currency is absolutely worthless, they're kind of weaving handbags out of it and trying to sell those because that would actually be worth something. There's been a lot of talk about hunger in Venezuela, so I think I can spell out how that works. I guess I've already said that, and time is short, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But here's some statistics on kidnappings in Venezuela. Kidnappings were happening under the previous democratic governments, but the red line shows the trends under the government of Hugo Chavez. And one thing to notice about this is that this trend ends in 2011. And I'm sure, although I don't have the statistics, I'm sure it has continued to increase, if not accelerate, in the last 7 years. So is there a way out? I would look at several different scenarios. One would be a democratic exit in which the government holds elections and the opposition wins and is allowed to take power. What might lead us to believe that that could happen? Well, one is that there was an opposition coalition called the MUD, M-U-D, for Democratic Unity Roundtable. And the MUD actually won the 2015 National Assembly election. In fact, it won 2/3 of the seats in the National Assembly in that election. And also, even now, polls show that the government has only minority support. So you'd expect, okay, opposition should be able to win an election, and new elections are coming up. They're scheduled for May 20th. So those are positive signs. On the other hand, as soon as the MUD won control of the National Assembly, the courts removed, kind of disqualified enough of the legislatures that it no longer had a 2/3 majority that would be necessary for overturning decrees or amending the Constitution. And it then delayed and unconstitutionally postponed regional and local elections, so they didn't have to compete on those. And since then, there have been elections, but before they didn't have to use fraud, at least not very much, but in the last election they absolutely did, and it's very well documented. There are hundreds of political prisoners now, like any opposition leader who could be a challenger to Maduro in an election or in a gubernatorial election can expect to be put in prison at least for a little while. Venezuelans I know talk about a carousel, like nobody stays in prison permanently. They're put in for a few months and then they're taken out when somebody else is put in, so that the total number of prisoners is kept low, but everybody gets punished. And probably the worst problem is that the opposition is really divided. Ideologically, it's a diverse group of people. There are people on the right, and there are people on the far left, communists, and everything in between. There are people who don't have much ideology, but they're divided not so much by ideology as over strategy, like who is going to be our presidential candidate if we run? Should we compete in an election at all? Does it make sense to be participating in this system, or should we be supporting a military option? Or they just have a lot of trouble deciding about how to respond to this crisis that they're in. Most recently, the bulk of the opposition parties and the MUD has decided to boycott the May elections coming up. They're not going to participate. There are a few people in the opposition who have decided to participate, but for the most part, they're not going to be in it. So I don't think a democratic exit is in the cards for the next few years at least. What about an internal reform? Maybe Maduro can become a more democratic president, or somebody in the ruling coalition could do that. You could say, well, something like this has to happen because this situation cannot last. Things are at an extreme crisis. Something has to change, and creditors are demanding change. Venezuela has a debt that is overdue now. I mean, it should be declared in default, but they keep kind of papering things over and managing to avoid a decision like that. And also, Maduro is no Chavez. He's not charismatic. He's not brilliant. I think his supporters are more lukewarm in supporting him than Chavez's supporters ever were. So it seems like maybe something could happen. But on the other side, The big obstacle is that this regime has become what political scientists call a kleptocracy, which is ruled by thieves, people who steal. And so they have zero interest in surrendering power because they have a great fear that if they ever step out of power, the next government that comes in is going to prosecute them for all the money that they have stolen. And they've stolen a whole bunch of ways, just out and out bribes and misuse of funds, but also things like taking protection money from drug trafficking organizations. In fact, Venezuela's previous vice president is on the U.S.'s official DEA list of drug traffickers who's subject to arrest if he ever sets foot in the United States. And there seems to be very solid military backing for Maduro. Chavez and Maduro systematically purged the military so that the only people who are allowed to rise to high office in the military are people who are loyal to the regime and are true believers in the ideology. And they're complicit in a lot of the dirty schemes that have been going on as well. So they also fear prosecution if they allow a different government to come into power. What about a foreign invasion? Our own president suggested that. You never know how serious he is about any of this, but he did utter the words that maybe we have to invade Venezuela. But I don't think anybody outside of Donald Trump takes that very seriously, if even he does. Because occupying Venezuela would be a burden that would bring us few, if any, benefits, and it would be an extremely costly adventure that's almost certain to fail. So let's just discard that. Military coup is probably the thing that people talk about the most. On the plus side of this happening, not in favor of it, but saying that it might be likely. The military already has a very strong presence in this government. Quite a few cabinet ministers and quite a few governors are military officers already. They have a lot of influence. In fact, there's a General Padrino who's some people treat as kind of a co-president with Maduro, like maybe he has a veto over anything Maduro wants to do, and that's why they're allowing him to stay in power. That's a rumor, I can't confirm that. Also, the military shares a lot of interest with the Chavistas, and really, it's the only institution in the country that has the physical power to remove Maduro and effectively govern the country after that. So that's why people talk about the military a lot. On the other hand, if the military is not completely unified, if it's divided, then a takeover could lead to fratricide. Military fighting military could be it could be a very bloody coup or even a civil war, which is not desirable. And it's really not clear how competent the military is for governing the country. Would it be able to make decisions about how to end inflation, how to resolve the multiple exchange rates that Venezuela has, how to revive the oil company, increase production, and what to do about crime? Nobody really knows what they would do about those things. And I really don't think that the military, if it were to seize power, would be interested in overseeing a transition to democracy in the foreseeable future. But I think that of all the scenarios, it's the thing that's most likely to happen. If there's a military dictatorship, it would probably be a not very nice military dictatorship. It would probably be repressive and corrupt, like the government has been so far. It might continue to use the socialist rhetoric that Chavistas have used because they've been indoctrinated in that. Maybe not. Maybe it'd be something like Assad's regime in Syria, although without the religious divides in the population. Or maybe more likely would be something like Cuba, except on a much larger scale. I think neighboring countries like Brazil and Colombia would probably be relieved if a new government, even if it's an authoritarian government, could slow the exodus of Venezuelans from the country. I mean, they wouldn't openly say that. They couldn't say, thank God there's a military regime that's going to solve these problems. But they might be secretly happy about that. And I think that I wouldn't hold my breath for a return to democracy if the military seizes power. I think it would take years for things to evolve and opinions to change before they would allow that to happen. So I want to make it very clear, since I'm being recorded here, I'm not endorsing the idea of a military coup. I'm just saying I think this is the most likely exit from the situation. So I'll stop there, and maybe we have some Q&A.